If we all took away something from all of this, it would be this. If you're a game developer, don't ride the subway. That was, in fact, our first clue at there being a third installment in Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix's reboot of the Lara Croft Tomb Raider franchise. And ever since 2013, or I think it was 2013, when we got the release of that first Tomb Raider that was supposed to be a brand new, gritty, and very mature take on the character, we were all pleasantly surprised because it wasn't gritty for being gritty's sake. It was actually a well-made, competent game that really explored the development of a classic character while at the same time giving something fresh and new for younger or much more amateur, I don't want to say amateur, but new coming audiences, not only to that generation of consoles with the PS3 and Xbox 360, but also who people were familiar with Lara Croft and maybe weren't necessarily the most fondest of her very exaggerated features. So they dialed it back, and Square Enix and most importantly the developers Crystal Dynamics as well as Eidos Montreal, they were able to construct a brand new version of the character that it's going to be hard to not look at Tomb Raider the same way without thinking of this version of Lara as opposed to the triangle boobed version of her from the 90s. So we have our classic take, but I think this one could actually stand the test of time just as well. So now here we are about 5 years after the release of the original and after a very controversial release of the second installment with Rise of the Tomb Raider, after it having a time exclusive on Xbox and then them doubling back with then releasing it on the PS4. They decided, alright, no more of that shit. We're going to release it on all platforms, or at least on the two main platforms, Xbox One and PlayStation 4, with the third entry in this rebooted series, and that is going to be for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Because if you're making a sequel, you gotta have two obligatory words, Shadow and Rise. Nothing is getting out of Rise and Shadow. You rise and you shadow. You rise and you shadow. Because if you're getting into a darker sequel, you gotta rise. You gotta have a shadow. You gotta get dark. And that's what Crystal Dynamics set out to do with their new game, in which Lara now finds herself trying to stop a Mayan apocalypse after certain events unfolded during the beginning of this game, while at the same time dealing with Trinity once more with the help of her friend Jonah. And this third entry is supposed to, like I said, develop more of Lara's character and more of her personality, and that's definitely the focus point. Because the story here is not 100% the sharpest. In fact, not only does the story not feel immensely different from the past two games that I think would have had a much more profound effect on this game being the more darker one, the more serious tone one, if, hypothetically speaking, those two other games didn't happen. Say, for example, this, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, like I said, in a completely alternate reality. If this were to be the first game of the franchise, not so much that 2013 version, I think then you will seriously be going, oh my god, that was gritty, that was bloody, that was, holy shit, I was not expecting Tomb Raider to go in that direction. But after you see Lara crawl out of a pool of blood and corpses from that first game, the stuff that you not only see her kind of go through in this game, as well as some of the things that she actually does to other people, or mainly the bad guys, it's kind of like, okay, well, she's kind of at the point where she's 100%ing her journey, not necessarily the most shocking thing anymore. That, and also her stopping this Mayan apocalypse and uncovering the ruins of ancient Inca and Maya culture, while at the same time delving into some potentially supernatural entities that aren't 100% supernatural, but there's kind of like a supernatural twist to them, is not necessarily, again, out of the ordinary for a Tomb Raider game. Not only within Crystal Dynamics' reboot, but also even some of those past games where she's uncovering mummies that are starting to walk, and she's dodging dinosaurs. She had a game where she was dodging dinosaurs, so the shit that she deals here, it's kind of like, alright, I don't see any kind of unique twist on it. I mean, you can take some of those stories and add a brand new spin to it. Nothing like that necessarily happens within the stories, so it's shallow at that point. So I'm like, okay, cool. If that's the case, then I'm waiting for the gameplay to really surprise me, but at this point, what are you going to do in terms of the writing? What are you going to do in terms of how you kind of construct the story for Lara? And I think that all falls on the shoulders of Lara herself. Unfortunately, Lara's not necessarily the best and most likable person when you first start playing this game. I don't know whose decision it was, but Lara is, for lack of a better term, kind of a bitch in this game, at least when she starts out. Because I think that would have been the thing to kind of maybe make me be a little easier on her, is that maybe if she started in this game the way that she kind of was in Rise of the Tomb Raider, which in my opinion is so far the perfect balance of this brand new version of Lara, where she's not completely inexperienced like she was in 2013, but at the same time she's not the other side of the spectrum where she is here, to the point where she's disregarding a good chunk of a town's population for the sake of chasing the bad guys and stopping them from grabbing the sacred artifact. And you have secondary characters like Jonah telling her, like, I think you should get your priorities straight at this point. And I'm glad that at least some characters were kind of self-aware to her personality, but it would have gelled with me better if she was kind of starting to grow to that dark side, to that shadow version of her. I keep pulling out. I like the steelbook, guys. I'm sorry, I like holding this. That's the one perk about getting this game day one. I got the steelbook. Alright. Enough plugging that in. If she started out the way that we left her in Rise of the Tomb Raider, that would have been fine. But instead, she literally has moments within the first 10 minutes of this game where I'm just like, why are you being like this? Like, I really hope that we can kind of flashback a little bit. And they kind of do, but only literally like from a few days. And it still doesn't do a good job at shedding light on the character for her behaving this way. And then as the game progresses, she kind of comes to terms with what exactly she's been doing and how she's been kind of reacting and acting to certain people. And sure, you can kind of see that as a redemptive arc, but there's not a whole lot there to kind of justify it. So Lara herself is flawed, but not necessarily in the best way possible, or even in the good way possible in general in this game. So it's a little hard to kind of attach myself to her. Although I did manage to mention one reluctant hero in this game, and that is Jonah. Poor Jonah. I feel like this is actually the farthest that he's come in all three games, and I'm really surprised that he made it this far. And of course, I was kind of having my predictions as to where he was going as a character in terms of his potential fate, but outside of that, I'm glad to see that he's the unsung hero of the story. He's the moral compass for Lara, and I know that that was the intention with the character, but at that point I was actually hoping to jump into the playable shoes of Jonah as opposed to Lara. I wonder who's going to be the icebreaker. This motherfucker. It was really tough to like her. She wasn't hateable. Like, I didn't necessarily hate her or wish for her to be dead. I just wanted that Rise of the Tomb Raider Lara back. That, again, was that perfect blend. Like a coffee. Like a really good, delicious coffee. If you go too far on one side, it's a little too sweet. If you go on the other side, you get a little too much bitter. Rise of the Tomb Raider for Lara is so far the perfect macchiato. So Tomb Raider came out on the last generation with PS3 and Xbox 360. Rise did manage to make it into the Xbox One, but after a timed exclusive, then later revamped over to the PlayStation 4. This one is probably the latest and possibly only Tomb Raider game we're going to get on the PS4 and Xbox One until the next generation of consoles are revealed, because they're just right around the corner and I feel it in my balls. So, being the latest game to be released in this current generation, it's a little daunting to notice that the visuals are kind of a mixed bag. And I think we kind of saw that a little bit with the trailers. I was actually rather surprised to see that a lot of people were in the same camp as I was, where we were like, is it just me, or does this visually not look leaps and bounds than the last game? Of course, it's all about the gameplay at the end of the day, but you think that having a longer time gap between this game and the last game versus the first two, where it was only like, I think 2 years, and here we had like 3 years since the last one, it's like, I think you could have polished up on a few of the visuals. And sure, this game, technically speaking, looks a whole lot better than the 2013 Tomb Raider did on Xbox 360 and PS3, but that kind of goes without saying. Here, the environments are, I think, what takes center stage in terms of virtual fidelity, because the environments are actually rather great, especially when you throw in some of that dynamic lighting and the atmosphere. It really works together well, especially since some of these places are supposed to be a little bit more than human, or more than out of this world, to in terms of excavating through these tombs and uncovering these places that are of myth. They're supposed to have a mythical quality to them, and they actually genuinely look great. So great that I took advantage of the added day one patch photo mode, and it's actually a pretty good one. I don't think it's as deep as some photo modes I've seen before, but it does a good job at capturing what was actually really admiring about the visuals, or at least about the environments. Character models, on the other hand, they're not bad. Actually, they're still technically good, better than some of those other games out there like Mass Effect Andromeda, for God's sakes. It's just that during the cinematics, I think is when they shine the best. It's an in-game where I think that some facial expressions are a little off, some eyes look a little dead, whether it be from some of the NPCs or even Lara herself, to where she goes kind of cross-eyed in certain sections. And then also some skin, I know this is very nitpicky, but some skin textures just look a little too smooth to where I'm like, that doesn't necessarily look 100% human, unless we get super close to Jonah's nose, which a couple times we did. It was rather uncomfortable, but at least I can admire all the detail in the pores of his fucking nose. Jesus. Prior to that day one patch that came with the photo mode, there were a couple of bugs that I managed to find, whether it be me not being able to run. Like, there was a section where I was clearly supposed to run, and yet Lara did not want to sprint. And other times I couldn't access a door, and then there was one that really tripped me out.
Sounds good.
What the? Whoa! And I hate to dog on this game anymore visually, but there's something that so far from what I can tell has not been fixed with a day one patch. And that is that I know it's a game, and I know that it's supposed to be a little easier on it from the likes of a movie or a TV show, God's sakes, even a comic book. But there's some leaps in logic that are a little hard to digest, where Lara's wearing a particular disguise, or she's talking English to a native and yet that native understands her. Or she's supposed to be, like I said, in disguise, and yet the bad guys just don't notice certain qualities that it's just a little hard to suspend disbelief, even if it's a video game. The exact same thing I could say about the audio. The atmospheric sound effects were great. It made me feel like I was actually there, especially when you get to some of those mythical areas where they really play around with sound, and they mix certain things together to kind of create a whole new sound that will catch me by surprise, along with, again, some of the Foley that's just top-notch in this game. It really is. So when we get to the voice acting, that things get a little questionable. Now, Camilla Luddington, she's still great as Lara Croft. I still bought her as the character. I just think that her material could have used to work when it comes to that whole likability thing because of how she was acting at the beginning. And then, I don't know the actor's name, but the guy who played Jonah, I think it was great, again, because he kind of took center stage here, being the more likable character, the more sensible character. Anyone outside of that, however, I mean, you got your main bad guy who sounds kind of generic. I mean, it's funny because the only reason I want to say he's not generic is only because he almost sounded like he had a Thanos complex. So in terms of like the way he was written. So, and plus compared to what Lara does at the beginning to kind of have the course of events transpire as you progress in the game, it's kind of like, well, you seem brighter and more, different than any other bad guy by comparison. And then outside of that, we get into the NPCs that kind of range from to actually kind of bad. And I hate to sound like I'm profiling, but it's most of the time the natives. Whether you're visiting Peru or you're visiting an ancient Mayan town or village that has them speaking that ancient dialect, it almost 90 to 95% of the time, it sounds like they're reading it. That's primarily why. It has nothing to do with the language or the accents or anything, but it almost always sounds like they're reading it, especially the kid actors, where I just don't buy them being in whatever situation they're in because it legitimately sounds like they're reading it word for word. I'll say that even some of my people, some of the people from Mexico who are speaking Spanish sound like they do in those commercials you've sometimes see on Telemundo when you go to Vallarta and you're waiting to get your slab of meat from the butcher, but you have to wait for them to call out your number, so you're watching the Telemundo that's on TV, and they sometimes play those commercials, and those commercials has the women talking about how, you could trade to like T-Mobile Wireless or DirecTV Mas or something like that, and they have that very infomercially voice. Some characters actually sound like that here.
Tenga cuidado si va al cementerio, señorita. Ahí vive una bruja y le gusta convertir a las personas en ranas.
Alright, so when it comes to a video game, the writing might not be as strong and maybe the visuals are not exactly the most photorealistic, but the gameplay. As long as the gameplay's fun, it could be a great game. Here's the thing. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is more Tomb Raider, and the gameplay is not necessarily reinvented for this third outing of the game, which by definition is kind of disappointing when, again, it's been 3 years since the last one, so you expect there to be something really revamped and get us, hooked to be like, oh my god, I cannot wait for the sequel. There's got to be a reasoning for why the sequel is just so anticipated. And then as I progressed through the hours of this game, I realized, they really did just copy and paste the gameplay from the first one with a couple of tweaks here and there. The gameplay still consists of the basic fundamentals of a Tomb Raider game. You got your platforming, you got your puzzle solving, and then you got your combat fighting, whether it be against the forces of nature, and in this game you actually have to fight back against certain bestial animals, most specifically jaguars that reside within the jungle of Peru, as well as other environments, these very tropical lush environments. And then you also got the humans that you got to fight against using either very head-on tactics with gunplay or stealth options where you kind of sneak around and take them out one by one. And each of these branches of gameplay has, at least as far as I can think of and remember back to playing the game, one little facet that got kind of tweaked and adjusted for this new version of the game that I sincerely don't remember there being in either Tomb Raider or Rise of the Tomb Raider. The puzzles, I always consider the puzzles in this new version of Tomb Raider from Crystal Dynamics to be like traversal puzzles, where it's not so much, figuring out a map or figuring out a code or something like that. Even though you do that from time to time in this game, it's more so about how are you going to get Lara from point A to point B, because everything's kind of collapsed together and you kind of have to set everything in motion and kind of build yourself a little do-it-yourself Robin Goldberg, I can't remember what the name is called, but you know those machines where you drop the ball and then that causes this thing to fall. There's a name for it. There's an actual technical name for it. But that's kind of what you're doing here as you progress through these puzzles as Lara, and that's kind of what you did in the last ones, where you have to shoot your arrow and pull the rope so that this whole thing kind of collapses, and then you shoot water into another thing, and you kind of do that. It's more of the same here, only I think the only little element that I kind of picked up was different was that when you're kind of jumping from craggly wall to the next, because I love saying the term craggly walls, because I'm going to start using it from now on. Craggly walls. You can now kind of climb on the ceilings as soon as you get some added support for your boots, where you got like little teeth on your boots that let you climb up the ceilings. So that was the only thing that I can think of for that facet of the game. And then when it comes to some of the platforming, where you have to jump from platform to platform like you've done before with Lara, this one had just a little bit more running in it. And this is also where your set pieces were much more woven into, because some of these traversal pieces, ever so often it's during a calm setting where you just have to, again, get from point A to point B. But then other times, shit is just going down around you in a very apocalyptic way, so it's up to you to dodge as many dangers as possible while at the same time running and jumping from one platform to the next. And at times, it felt a little Crash Bandicoot-y. But I still have to give credit where credit is due, and some of these set pieces really are exhilarating, and there's even some moments that are very claustrophobic with their tight spaces. I felt like this one had more tight space spots than the last two games, to where I think I might get claustrophobic from this game. And combat in this game is, again, not so different than it was before, except maybe when you take on a much more stealth approach against some of these bad guys. The game emphasizes something that even the developers called having Lara become one with the jungle, in which she turns into pretty much Arnold from The Predator, where she's covering herself up in mud and going up against the walls, and then she like opens her eyes, and that's where she knives the dude and kind of brings her back into the bushes. There's a lot more emphasis on that, and I'm not gonna lie, pretty badass to sometimes pull it off in the right combo, where I'm just kind of creeping around in the darkness and just taking out these other bad guys one by one. And it's also, what makes it even cooler is that you think back to how 2 games prior, Lara was just heaving and just crying at the thought of killing her first person in general, and now here she is just totaling them. But now it kind of makes a little better sense because it's been a couple of years. I just wish that her likability or her reasonability with saving the many and sacrificing those riches, I really hope that she would have a better moral compass. But again, I've already had my say for that. At least I'm glad that it fed into the gameplay a little bit more fluidly, and it also made up for some badass, really key moments in the game, especially when you throw in certain mechanics like being able to take down guys from a branch, Batman style, and rope them up and just keep them hung there for display. And then whenever a bad guy just kind of catches eye of it, it's just like, oh shit, what's going on? And just having them live in fear. And then sometimes even turning these enemies against each other through fear. or poison darts. The only type of enemy that was kind of striking me a little bit with fear were some of these Jaguar boss battles, because the game is actually not very hefty on boss battles. There's one obligatory one at the end that I kind of saw coming, but the ones that I thought were actually a little bit more ingenious in a sense were these Jaguar fights, where I don't know if maybe they ruthlessly studied jaguars, like the developers actually went and the engineers and programmers went out into the jungle to study jaguars, because these things felt legit. They actually look like how a jaguar would attack a human being, and so I had to kind of think the way they did whenever I had to turn the tables on the jaguar, and so that the prey can then become the predator and vice versa. Cool little side note though, if any of this gameplay proves to be just a little bit too familiar towards like the last games, and maybe as it goes down the road it becomes a little too easy, the game lets you modify the difficulty very extravagantly. Not only can you just change the overall difficulty from easy to medium to hard, but you can also toggle certain facets of all of this gameplay. If you want the combat to be easy but you want the puzzles and the platforming to be hard, there you go. You can actually kind of switch that around, and Lara will give you less hints, but then the bad guys will be a little bit easier to take on, and just kind of switch it all back and forth to where I think that this is the most customizable difficulty I've seen in a game, at least for me. There might be some other ones that can do the same exact thing, but it's cool that they kind of put that in here in Shadow. But if you don't want to toggle any of that and give yourself the strongest difficulty level and become truly the Tomb Raider, then you could do so as you progress in the game and you upgrade Lara Croft just like you did in the past game, where you got skill points as you gain more and more XP that you get either by beating certain missions or achieving certain unlockables or gathering certain items or antiques, and then of course boosting up your intellectual properties about learning about this culture, because every time you read an encryption on the tomb or you kind of take a look at a journal or something like that, it feeds into your XP, and that's what lets you upgrade the skill points for Lara. And then also the more you gather resources from animals or little bins scattered around the environment, that's what lets you kind of upgrade your weaponry, similarly to the past games. So again, not really redefined, but it's still kind of addictive to go out there and kind of repeat that cycle of gathering the XP, leveling Lara up, gathering sources, boosting up the strength of your bow and arrow, boosting up the recoil as well as the ammo capacity for your guns. In my opinion, that was to me the most addictive facet, was the hardware, me being able to upgrade the guns and the artillery and the weaponry and even some of my clothes to better suit Lara to her environment, or how she's gonna play the way I play her. That to me was my favorite part. Skill points are a little, to me personally, complicated to kind of get adjusted to, because the upgrade tree has those upgrades where you don't necessarily get more health. It's just like for example, one upgrade is you being able to cause damage with your bow and arrow for like 5.3 seconds or something like that. It's just an exaggerated example, but that's kind of what you find yourself in that upgrade tree, and it's not necessarily the most intuitive upgrade tree. So if you like some of that much more complicated RPG stuff, then you're gonna like the upgrade tree here in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. But for me, I found myself using more of the upgrades for the weapons than I did for Lara herself. So Lara's adventure in this game is pretty much on par with the last ones, where it's about 10, 12, maybe 14 hours or so in length, but you can definitely stretch it out with some of the content on the side that gives this game an ample amount of replay value. But that's only if you really like this form of gameplay and you didn't have any kind of issues with it, where I primarily focused on the story, and what it's kind of neat is that it borrows side content from both the past, the two games that you've had so far in Crystal Dynamics Pedigree, whether it be the challenge tombs from the original Tomb Raider, where it kind of has a linear path, but ever so often you'll have like a little cave where you can go down and explore a tomb. That's not necessarily part of the story and you don't have to do it, but if you're up for an extra sense of danger, another environmental puzzle to solve, or even an extra boss battle to kind of hunt down like another jaguar or another set of enemies, then boom, you got yourself some more challenge tombs in this game, some of which you can definitely download with the season pass. But something they brought back from Rise of the Tomb Raider are actual side quests or side missions, because ever so often the game for the most part is a very linear narrative, but ever so often there's patches of open worldness, as I like to call it, where certain environments are a little bigger than just your narrow path. And when you find yourself in these environments, you have NPCs with little quests to give you and kind of go do around. And they're not exactly the most extravagant side quests. Like, they don't take very long to beat. I think the average amount of time to beat some of these side quests are about 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. So it doesn't really take long. In fact, I'm convinced I might have completed all of them at this point. But they're a little extra thing to do if you've gotten tired of digging up old antiques and trying to gather all the necessary valuables and journal pages, and then of course doing the challenge tombs, and you kind of want to break from that, then at least you got some kid who lost his dice and you got to go find it. And when you do, you got some other guy telling you to go fetch something else. But at least it has a narrative, and it's a break from the usual Tomb Raider gameplay you were probably doing at this point. So, final verdict time. It's cool that there's little moments here and there that are genuine highlights of greatness. Whether it be with those little elements here and there that were added to almost every little face of gameplay that makes up Tomb Raider, to the graphic fidelity on some of the environments that can only be achieved now on platforms such as Xbox One and PS4 or even PC. I think this came out on PC, but you only have to download it. And then, of course, little inklings in the story that are generally captivating and could made up for a very interesting take on Lara, especially when you ever so often kind of delve into her past as a little girl, and you're like, okay, maybe that's where all this obsession could kind of stem from. It's just that the obsession goes a little too far, a little too early in the game, and that's what caused me to have a very rippling disconnect from Lara herself than I ever did with the past two games, to where, again, my favorite version of Lara so far from this new reboot is from Rise of the Tomb Raider. With Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I felt like they dipped in quality with her character, and because of that, it's a little harder for me to kind of overlook the somewhat copy and paste nature of the gameplay here from the past two games. Because if the story was elevated to something brand new, or the characterization of Lara wasn't so diminished or somewhat tarnished, then I was able to kind of overlook that. But because of that, the best way I can summarize this game is that it's simply just more Tomb Raider, which is great, and it's still a very competent, well put together game, but it's still by definition a disappointment, considering that I was really hoping for them to kind of peak with this game rather than with the second one. You can say that maybe Rise of the Tomb Raider is the Dark Knight, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is the Dark Knight Rises. So for that, I'm going to be giving Shadow of the Tomb Raider a low 8 out of 10. So now it's time for me to hear from you guys. Have you guys played Shadow of the Tomb Raider? Which console did you play it at? Did you keep it exclusively to Xbox like they did with Rise? But at the same time, it's like, okay, now you have all three games on the Xbox One. Or did you go with the PS4? Did you get the limited edition Steelbook case? I'm bragging at this point. Anyways, let me know your guys' thoughts on the video game in the comments below, as well as thoughts on my review. And also make sure to show your guys' love and support. I would really, really appreciate it. Just hit the like and share button. And of course, subscribe for more videos, whether it be more reviews such as this one, or maybe even some more best of play videos. Please, guys, check out the best of play videos. I work really hard on them, but I honestly think that they're really, really fun to kind of go back and watch, because it's just a perfect montage of all the best gameplay bits that I really liked. And I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did putting them together. Please check them out. Best of play. I should have one or two up of Tomb Raider, a handful of Spider-Man, and then a couple of the latest episodes, or possibly even the last episode of the Walking Dead Telltale series. Thank you guys so much for watching again. Make sure to follow me on Twitter. I'm trying to be a little bit much more active on Twitter. You'll see my handle at the very end of this video, at DarkSpiderDavid. Follow me on Twitter, on Instagram. I also have a Twitch link for DarkSpiderDavid, so twitch.tv/DarkSpiderDavid, only because I'm currently hoping to get my internet situation rectified, and if so, then maybe I'll start legitimately streaming, not even posting videos, but actually just flat out streaming on Twitch with video games and other things. We'll see about that. Not making any promises, but I think you guys should definitely look out for that. But again, follow me on Twitter. I'm trying to be a little bit much more active on there, and I think it's proven to be really, really well. So please do that, and I'll see you guys all on the next video. The Peter Parker that we know and love was still there. There was never a point where I hated him. I actually enjoyed watching him on screen. Multiple times, he actually did manage to make me laugh with a couple of the quips. Like I said, I felt like he was quipping a little too much, where his hit and miss ratio was a little higher than past Spider-Man that I have watched, both in live action and cartoon.
They webhead. Now you know what a wrecking ball feels like. If I wanted to ride the Tilt-A-Whirl, I'd have gone to Coney Island.